This is What's Wild in New Hampshire by wildlife biologist Eric Orff. It's another snowy day here in New Hampshire. I was just thinking, how does wildlife survive the winter here in New Hampshire? Or what do they do when winter comes? Just like you and me, most of our wildlife that spend the winter here, they put their winter coats on. They do. So for animals like our foxes, in the fall they grow a thick undercoat of fur, their winter coat, when the trappers would call the pelt to be prime, when it's best used by us from the trappers who take fur. So in the winter time they put their winter coat on, which is a thick layer undercoat of fur. So here is a red fox and a muskrat. So yes, a muskrat who must live all winter long in the ice cold water of New Hampshire, still feeding. These animals are active all winter long, feeding every day. They got to be out in the worst of the weather every day, all winter long. They put on their winter coats to do that. So what are some of the other things that happen? Well, of course, in the fall, a lot of our birds migrate. So they migrate south, and other things, like our worms migrate south. And did you know that dragonflies migrate south and monarch butterflies? Did you hear me say worms? Just testing. Worms do not migrate south. You know what happens to our worms? They all die. All our worms die. They freeze to death in the frozen soil every winter. So every spring, it's the eggs that the worms laid the previous summer and fall that hatch to become the new worms, except for the night crawlers. They go below the frost line and survive. So you will never find a worm that's more than a year old, but our night crawlers can be more than a year old. Lots of other insects survive, as the worms do, by laying eggs in the soil. So grasshoppers and crickets, you name the insect, they lay their eggs in the fall. Of course, other insects are aquatic. Their eggs are laid in the water. So a lot of the insects actually spend the winter in the bottom of our ponds and rivers and streams here in New Hampshire, and as do other animals. And now, of course, turtles, they go to the water in the wintertime. Our spotted turtles and blanding turtles, they all go to the wetlands in the winter. I do remember as a young fellow when I was hunting one fall, and I came by what was a spring that came out of the ground in Londonderry, where I grew up in North Londonderry. And I went by this little spring hole that I had kind of, at one time it had some kind of a structure on it, I think a wooden structure. So I think it was probably dug out and was used for watering cattle or sheep for many years. Well, that had all kind of caved in, but the little, maybe 3 or 4 foot around spring bubbled up and flowed into the nearby marsh. And as I walked by it, it was muddy. The water was muddy, and as I stood and said, why is that water muddy? I could see the actual ground within that spring moving, shimmering. So I took my coat off and drove my arm down into that mud that was at that spring, and what was down there but a big old snapping turtle. So snapping turtles, they breathe through their skin in their anus in the wintertime, and they go into the water, into a spring or a pond for the wintertime. So the animals migrate. Now for our deer and moose, what do they do when they put their winter coat on? Their winter coat has long, hollow hair, so an extra insulation for our moose and deer. And I'm sure you've probably seen pictures, as I have, of when it's snowing out, of deer and moose standing there with snow on their back. It doesn't even melt because they are so well insulated. So lots of things migrate south, not just birds, but some insects, our dragonflies and butterflies. I think ladybugs, some of those move to the coast in the wintertime, as do some other things. Our loons move to our coast. They don't necessarily go south. So a lot happens in the fall, but in the wintertime, folks, our wildlife is putting on a layer of fat, putting on their winter coat, and hunkering down for the winter, and as most of us do, I guess, as well. So yeah, wintertime, some stay and some go, but we all get ready for winter with our winter coats. So this is wildlife biologist for What's Wild in New Hampshire.